in that a fellow traveler of mine from way back in the day is someone by the name of Andrew Clement. So a big shout out, Andrew. Thanks for sending me a note about this particular research that you've been working on called Defund Big Tech, Refund Community, with the subtext being antitrust is not enough, another tech is possible. And what's interesting about this research report that these researchers, of which Andrew is one of them, has just released, is they've done this to chime into the antitrust policy discussion, right? This is the whole thing of, should we break up Facebook? Should we break up Amazon? Should we break up Google, aka Alphabet? And while this policy discussion moves forward, these are some radicals, these are some academics, these are some researchers and scholars who are stepping forward to say that antitrust isn't enough. We need to be imagining alternatives. We need to be thinking about what could be better than these digital platforms, what we could be replacing with these digital platforms. And that's where they're using the language, defund big tech, refund community. And I'm only guessing here, but my hypothesis is that because we have given our data, because we have built big tech, because big tech has been built off the backs of us as a community, well, that's why we need a refund, right? We want our data back. We want the money that's been made off our data back. So if we're going to talk about antitrust, maybe we should talk about breaking the bank. Maybe we should talk about getting what's owed to us, our 40 acres and a mule, when it comes to the way in which big tech has extracted our personal information and built an empire off of it. So let's read the introduction here and see if it resonates. They have a quote from Jeff Bezos. "The only way I can see to deploy this much financial resource is by converting my Amazon winnings into space travel," which was a humble brag that Bezos made about all the money that he's making off of Amazon. So I'm going to read the intro. Jeff Bezos offered the comment quoted above regarding the wealth that he has acquired as Amazon CEO and dominant shareholder. Here we consider the harms produced by Amazon, along with other so-called big tech companies, Apple, Alphabet, Facebook, Microsoft, and offer a better proposal for how we might collectively redeploy their enormous revenues in the service of earthly flourishing. The Black Lives Matter-led movement against systemic racism and the long abolitionist organizing movement in the United States provide important context for our efforts. I guess I was right in evoking the 40 acres and a mule. We are inspired by renewed calls to defund the police in the United States, which have reinvigorated vital debate regarding the funding of police departments and who is actually served by them and what forms of historical injustice are perpetuated by current institutions of policing and incarceration. And thus, in the context of the abolitionist movement, to defund means to invite local and regional communities to decide how to redirect the disproportionate funds now invested in enforcement and imprisonment to support alternative, more holistic forms of well-being and public safety infrastructure. So, to be clear, what they're doing is they're adding their voices to the defund the police movement by saying that it is a template by which we might defund big technology. So to continue reading, in the spirit of that movement, we adapt some of its key concepts to the domain of public community information and communication infrastructures, particularly those now dominated by big tech. Our proposal is grounded on a key premise. To redirect big tech's excessive revenue flow, we must transform the condition and funding structures that enable it. The aim is to free up resources to support a wide range of socially beneficial ends, not least community-based and community-oriented initiatives to develop digital infrastructures that better serve the public interest. While we are not calling for the demise of big tech, we are calling for radical reform. And this includes the abolition of the conditions that create and normalize big tech's disproportionate reach over key technology infrastructure and their wide-ranging negative consequences for society and the environment. We aim to retain and expand the many benefits that people currently derive from digital technologies while better addressing their individual critical needs. Now, that's a pretty long paragraph. I almost wish that these guys would hire me to, edit and make this language a little more publicly accessible. But you kind of get the gist of what they're arguing here, which is to both change what essentially is the privacy laws that enable the data collection and surveillance capitalism to exist, but also create different funding mechanisms so that the money that's generated that go right back into community organizations. So allow me to briefly address this. For example, you could have privacy by default, so that when you sign up for Facebook, when you sign up for Twitter, by default, it's not collecting any of your personal information, and then you have to opt in for them to actually have that info and have targeted, tailored advertising. So on the one hand, that makes it harder for these organizations to be the advertising monsters that they are, but it also empowers the laziness that we all have as human beings, that we wouldn't have to actually do anything to protect our privacy. Instead, we're protected by default. But then the second piece of that, I'll just flatly articulate as a tax, right? Imagine we were to tax big tech. You want to be a big digital platform and serve hundreds of millions of users? Well, then you got to pay a community tax. And this community tax could only be applied to platforms that are very large. So you could set a threshold that once you hit 1 million monthly active users, that's when the tax is prorated. So it's a percentage. The bigger companies pay more, the smaller companies pay less. But the benefit of having a community tax is you could then fund community creation in terms of content subsidies. You could fund free and open source projects so that you could have infrastructure and technology that was available for software developers to use freely to create competitors and alternatives. And then finally, you could have a broadband fund. So you could actually afford universal internet access so that people who couldn't afford internet, whether they lived in Harlem or whether they lived in Tuktoyaktuk, that either way, they could get affordable and cheap internet. That to me sounds like a popular policy, right? A community tax that on the one hand subsidizes small content creators, subsidizes free and open source software developers, and subsidizes internet access as a whole so that everyone is able to benefit and get access to what we're talking about. That's where I think the idea of defunding big tech and refunding community starts to become a very valuable rallying call. Right? That if we start redistributing the resources away from Google, away from Amazon, away from Facebook, back to communities, so that those communities were actually empowered for the digital age and the digital economy, that's a real opportunity to get the internet we desire and the internet we deserve. And so that's where a big shout out again to Andrew Clement for sending me their paper and alerting us to the need to defund big tech and refund community. I think as an issue, it has tremendous potential. There's been quite a bit of chat here, so I'll only scroll up a little. Merlatron pointed the hamster wheels that we run on, which fuel their experiments, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the refund in running on these content mills and sort of generating all this attention for these platforms. We've built them. So I think that's part of why it's essential that we get this refund, that there is this community tax. I did point out that small social platforms wouldn't be taxed, so Merlatron kind of jokes that means Google Plus will be just fine because they don't have any users anymore. Moopod pointed out they call us consumers, but really they're the ones devouring us. They're the ones who are consuming us, and that goes to the old adage that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, right? It's our attention, it's our eyeballs that Facebook is selling. Mupod joked, refund us with some shark steak. And I think that was playing on the whole idea in terms of the fluff or the krull of how we're being eaten. Ottawa Detroit asked, does a social influencer with 2 million users on TikTok pay these taxes? Well, they obviously should. And I think that's a very important point, Ottawa Detroit. And maybe we'll actually focus on that as a future topic, because influencers is an area that I do want to keep coming back to and studying. And I think that's a good point. We're talking today about a community tax on platforms, but maybe that community tax should apply to influencers as well. Because part of what we alluded to earlier in the week on our segment on unionizing influencers is the idea that large influencers are digital platforms unto themselves, right? They evolved to become brands. And even though they exist and make money on Instagram and Twitch and YouTube, they often have their own websites, right? They sell merch. Guys like David Dobrik, they've created their own social media platforms. They've created their own social media apps. Casey Neistat did that as well. I mean, his didn't find success, but I think, yes, that community tax should apply to influencers of a certain size and scale, which thankfully would exempt the rest of us. So I think that's a fascinating point. I think we will come back to that in the future, because that's worth digging into a little further. But again, this idea of community empowerment shouldn't be left to just, mere lip service, right? Community empowerment shouldn't be something that social media companies can say as if it's, some a vapid or easy pledge. The same way that ending racism shouldn't be just lip service, right? It should be an institutional commitment. And I think that's part of why we're it's worth us developing this idea of a community tax or a community refund even further in the future, because I think it forces the digital companies to hold true on their commitment towards community empowerment, and it makes it tangible when it comes to the way in which we can leverage that. Although Ottawa Detroit, one final comment at that, at what point do they carefully try to curate a 999,999 user base and then have a decentralized platform in which any single platform can't hit the threshold? I'm okay with that, because if that incentivizes decentralization, well, that's a win-win as well. So I think we set that threshold so that it does enable, if they want to avoid the tax, staying decentralized, and we consider that a positive byproduct of the larger process.